Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to the talk. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Um, I'm Rebecca Burgess, and I'm a photo historian and collection specialist. And back in 2008, I received a PhD from Boston University in American Studies with a focus in photo history. And my dissertation was called Collecting Agency, Reversing the Camera's Gaze in 20th Century Lowell. And it looked at a number of photo collections in Lowell that were unanchored or missing crucial pieces of information, like the photographer's identity, and ways to approach classifying idiosyncratic collections like that in archives. One of the chapters focused on the Camera collection at the J. Mogan Center, a really beautiful, compelling collection. I had never been able to pinpoint the identity of the collection's photographer in the dissertation, although I hazarded a few guesses, none of them were Annie Powell. Fast forward 13 years later, and in 2021, I received a note on Facebook from out of the blue from a man named Bernie Zelich. And he wrote, "Are you the same Rebecca Burgess who wrote a paper on the Camera photo collection? I'm not a historian, but I've become fascinated with the collection for various reasons. It looks like I have stumbled on the identity of the photographer and some of the subjects. If you're the same person and want to contact me, I'd love to discuss." We connected, and I was so impressed because this man is thorough, or I would say dogged. With the dual mix of passion and patience, Bernie has rooted tirelessly through the area's physical and digital collections, auctions, churches, basements, and surfaced with incredible source materials, compelling evidence. It's been such a treat to watch as Bernie uncovers more and more about Annie Powell. And I'm so excited to see the next steps in bringing her extraordinary life and work to light. And here we have Bernie Zelich.
December 2020, that was almost 4 years ago. I'm rooting around the internet and I type in images of mill workers 1900s. Why did I do that? Because I'm looking for an image for a music video that I composed and was producing. It was a ghost story about a mill worker in the early 1900s. And there really wasn't much. Click, click, click. I come across the Camara collection. It's online, and I notice these are some pretty good candidates. Maybe not the guys, maybe not the ones that are, maybe this one. Oh, wait a minute. Then I looked at this. This is the one that we want. And that's the one that we settled on. And it became part of the music video, Five Threads of Gold. During the remaining time that we were working on the video, this person inspired us, the musicians and myself. We actually came up with a name for her, Rose. And Rose and I sort of got, in a way, personal. And I was very interested in finding out more. We already heard about the 1999 paper that Rebecca wrote, and I read that. And it said how in 1989, the Camara family brought these boxes of negatives, and Martha Mayo, who's well known in Lowell, the director, went out and she understood what they were immediately. She brought them in, and as Rebecca had suggested, there was some thought maybe a Portuguese member of the community was the one who took these photos. But the conclusion, Rebecca's words, the identity of the photographer or photographers of the collection remained a mystery. A mystery. I like mysteries, and I felt how hard could it be to solve this mystery? And my strategy was, instead of trying to figure out which Portuguese person took this photo, to start with the fact, to me it was a fact, that this is a very high quality photo. And there were not many photographers in early 1900s, especially as photographers started to lose their profession with the advent of Kodak cameras. There were not many photographers who would have had the skill, the equipment to produce a photo like this. And I studied and I studied. There's got to be some way of figuring out who in the early 1900s had the ability to produce this photo. And so I learned to use public records. An hour and a half into my look, and I do have records, that's actually the case, I came across this 1906 page in the Lowell City Directory. There were four photographers listed: Marion, Westcott, and Clark, Lothrop, and Cunningham. They've become very familiar to me by this point. And J and E H Powell, Columbia Studios, artistic work. I love that artistic work because that was the word I was looking for. But beyond that, if you look at this photo, it is very similar in style and quality to this. There's vignetting. There's clearly some work done here. And as I looked at this more and more, I became convinced that the negative, it was a glass plate negative, had work done to produce some of these beautiful effects. This is the mill you might want to work at, not the mill that actually was. So what did I do? I became very interested and I decided to make a trip to the Center for Lowell History. Tony Sampis, who ran the program there, was very helpful. He put the glass plate negative on a light table. You can see her on the right. And what do you know? I was absolutely right. You can see here that there are scratchings or chemical abrasion on the negative, which produced this. You can see it actually goes all the way through. It's probably a straight edge. You can see that there's lightness here that allows this, which would not be a natural effect. And you can also see at her feet that there was bleaching done or scratching away. And finally, the ugly utilities in the ceiling were also scratched or bleached away to have this effect, which allows us to have this look. Even as a detail, this little thing here is introduced. You can see that everything is done for composition and beauty. So I decided I was going to learn to use public records. We're talking about not just Lowell City Directory, but Ancestry.com, find my own records in various places, and census records, newspapers, and figure out where did this end up? Because I was getting nowhere. It turns out that the couple came over from England in the early 1890s. They had photo studios and they didn't have children. In 1906, their photo studio went bankrupt. They lost their house. John was publicly accused of adultery, and the couple separated for a number of years, about 10 years. And that's kind of the end of the road for me that I could see. He became mostly a glass fitter, and there's no record of what she did. So I decided to write a letter to the last possible place. It seemed like the Bacon family may have been the ancestors of this. So I found out that they lived in the Highlands, and I wrote a letter. Dear Bacon family, I essentially said, do you know anything about the old photos? I enclosed the photo of who I called Rose. I actually thought it might have been Annie Powell's niece, because she also worked in a mill. And that's what I asked him. Do you know anything about this? And didn't expect any answer. I figured that would be the end of the story. But lo and behold, 10 days later, at the end of my COVID shot, and I get a call from New Jersey. Hi, this is Bob Bacon. I used to live in the house where you sent that letter to. My father lives there now. I grew up there. He asked me to respond to you. We have hundreds of photos in the basement, or at least we did the last time I looked. And I said, are any of them glass plate negatives? Oh, yeah, he said, they're glass plate negatives. Last I looked, I said, any mill workers? He said, yeah, mill workers, mills, all that stuff. I have no idea who took them. I don't know who they are, but we've kept them. Some are on the walls. Bob went on to explain that in, I think it was 2004, his mother died young, and that side of the family, the history was lost. That happens a lot. So they didn't know that side of the family. But when I got to see the photos that were in the basement, there were many hundreds. And I decided about 85 of them were probably taken by Annie Powell. She was the one who died there in 1952. Um, we also know from public records that Annie Powell kept a scrapbook. There's actually a story at her 90th birthday, she died at 92, where she's looking through her scrapbook. And some of these actually show scrapbook, they were taken from scrapbooks. So the big thing is that before or after this 1906 ad, we had no idea that she took photos. But the biggest takeaway is that we know from that basement finding that she took a lot of photos and she was pretty good, and that her style and her patterns of style can be seen elsewhere all over mystery photos in Lowell, thousands of mystery photos in Lowell and beyond. So among the photos that were most common were cute kids photos. I almost see this as a pre-Norman Rockwell kind of thing. She actually sold postcards of cute kids doing things. Here's an example. And they actually had an ad in the late 1800s which said, "We excel at children's photos." That's something that I want to say we don't know for sure, was proud of. So here's some other examples in other collections of cute kids photos, 3 different collections. So we have one from the Parks Department in 1915, City Engineers, 1922, and the Camara collection, not mill workers, but another part of the collection, 1920. We also found biographical information about her, including portraits of her. So here we have photos of her playing tennis after a tennis game. That seems to be what she was doing. In about 18, let's see, she was 50, 1865. This would be 1865. This is her with her sister. This is her with her mother and a few other sisters. I guess all of her other sisters who were alive at that point. And this is her in the, I think, 1885 at her sister and brother-in-law's wedding. This would be in Blackpool, probably in England. Very elegant looking. And here we have 2 in the mid-1940s. She's alone here looking very elegant and with her sister, youngest sister, Clara. One of the things that we learn from seeing this is we get a sense of her, what she looks like. And actually, I want to show you one real surprise. So let's take a look here. This object to our right of her on this bench. It's a great surprise when I figured out what that was. That's been identified as a box camera. And if that's the case, then this really means that from age 15, if that's what she is there, to in her about mid-80s, she was a photographer, which makes her one of the longest lasting photographers anywhere. I think she would compete with a lot of people that way. But what I started to say is we can start to do facial recognition with some of these people, which I've done, and that's been very helpful. It's not always reliable, but very helpful. We also get a sense of what she looks like because that figures well into what I say are self-portraits, which she took on other jobs. She seemed to use herself a lot as both intentionally and unintentionally as a model in the portraits that she took, particularly with the city engineers of Lowell. So one of the things we can notice is even her late age, so she's wiry, and even in her late 80s, she kind of has a dancer's posture. She has a long neck. She has a bulbous nose. Those are all useful things. as we start looking for other things. And that allows me to start to say that this, where I believe she's about 65 in this photo in 1927, I believe that's actually her. If you blow this up, you see the bulbous nose, you see the wiry, straight statue. And this person, I believe, is in a lot of photos. We don't know for sure. We also get some biographical information, which is useful. They came over in the early 1890s, but this is the 1894 wedding of her brother George and Mary Alice Whiteley. That's over here and here, and that's her youngest brother, John. And so it looks like she went back. I think she went back about five times. Some of them actually documented and interesting reasons. But she apparently went back to be the wedding photographer, which also makes this very interesting because in addition to being early wedding photography, it's not your typical wedding photography of the time. It's not formal. It's actually vernacular and informal, trying to capture, I would argue, a sense of the people who she's taking the photos of. We even have situation of uh, Mary Alice Whiteley Townend's father with his arms folded. This is very informal. And this one I like. I did some research on this. See this little thing here? That's actually a bird whistle. My guess is that Mary Alice had a gift of a bird whistle and she was a bird lover. So we get some biography that we can kind of speculate about. This makes these people real. Notice that face because we're going to come back to it a little later. The one thing we didn't see is any photo of her husband, John. Like I said, in 1906, they split, public adultery charges, and he went off to do other things. And I find this photo was taken about 1903, but I believe much later, I see some drama here. His name is chopped off in half here. The drama I imagine is that she cut this off with the scissors at some point. So I'm going to go through three photos that are in the collection at length and talk about what we learned from them and what we learned from them that applies to other collections, mostly patterns of style, some forensics. So here we have a photo that she kept. We know that it was taken around in the early 1890s, about the time that she would have arrived, I believe, ahead of her husband. And the question is, why would she have kept a photograph of studio E.J. Champagne on 8 Hurd Street? And I think I have the answer. And that is that E.J. Champagne was renting a studio, but he actually was not really a photographer. In fact, if you go to records, which I've seen at the Harvard Business School, you see that Edmund Champagne, who was about 25 at the time and was a carpenter, and he worked for proprietors of locks and canals. So on the side, he rented this studio, and maybe he got a rich client that said, "We need a kid's photo. Can you do that?" And she was someone who was readily available. She lived nearby, and she would have done that. We have other evidence that she did take this photo, and that comes again to patterns of style. This is going to come up again and again. If you look carefully, there's two things. One is the placement of hands. Hands in all her photos, in many of her photos, are very important. Hands placed on shoulders, the way she holds her hands, the way he holds his hand here, very important. I almost see it as a sense of connection that was important to her. The other thing which is actually very significant, which helps us authenticate her photos in general, are what I call sham shadows. Take a look here. If there actually really is a light source from the left, it is making the shadow parallel to the horizon line. Take a look at this one. But in this one, the shadow is kind of all over the place. It loops around. It has nothing to do with this shadow. It's not, it defies the laws of physics. So, what's going on there? I would argue that this is done for composition. It's a way of bringing him into this chair. Someone who is very aware of art, composition, and how things work. Here's an example of that kind of sham shadow in 1931, much later. So in 1931, she would have subcontracted with the city engineers to document a cracked sidewalk. This actually might be of interest to you. This cracked sidewalk is on the left, would be St. John Baptiste Church in the French neighborhood. And that's actually in 1931. I guess Jack Kerouac would have been an altar boy there. I think he was either 9 or 10 at that point. So that was his church. So that has some historical significance. Um, we know that the east is over here and west is over here, sort of kitty corner, sort of diagonal that way. Consequently, the only real shadow here is this. And I'm going to do something which I do quite a bit with her photos, is I'm going to flip this to negative. So you can actually see, taking away the optical illusion of photography, what she was doing. And I think it becomes very clear. So we have the natural shadow here. We have very fake shadows of buildings. There's no sun on the other side here. There's only one sun in the universe that I know about. There's some lightness here, and this may actually be filled in here a little bit. And very significantly, we have this, which seems to be painted in, probably using chemicals. So a paintbrush, you can almost see the edges feathered out. Paintbrush here. We have this, which is very much filled in. And finally, we have something which is a little more subtle, which is what seems to be two lines going to the street. Uh, I know, I can tell you, I haven't talked about this before, but much of her photography has her personal religious symbols. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this is supposed to be that this looks somewhat like a cross, a street to the sidewalk where a church is right here. And I don't think it's coincidence that there is a path going to the street, suggesting that this is the way to fill it in. It's a religious kind of conversation. So other artistic choices that she made would include this. So I actually thought that this right here would, so we see telephone poles or utility poles here. This did not make sense next to a car. So I blew it up and tried to contrast it. It almost looks like it is a person that was rubbed out, possibly a woman in a dress. It's not totally conclusive. But we do have something very interesting besides that. Oh, and by the way, this, I believe, was rubbed out. This probably was the city engineer's car. She would have gotten rides. She lived 2 miles away. This is Dawn. I'm not sure she would have walked 2 miles with her tripod and heavy equipment. So I think the city and she had, I think she had 14 or 15 jobs that day. So city engineers would have carried her around, and very likely this, or if not that, this was the city engineer's car, lightened out here. So we do see another person in this photo, which is, I think, pretty significant. It's hard to see, but I'm going to call attention to it, this person right here. And if we blow that up and maybe do a little bit of contrast, to my way of thinking, that well could be a woman in a dress with walking shoes. And it's also possible that this is a woman specifically of age 72, because that was her age that day. And she was working, like I said, to her mid 80s. This is what she was doing. So this is, we don't know for sure. And it's possible it's not even a woman, but it sure looks like a dress, to meet and leg and shoes there. And I think that was an artistic choice for, if so, it was an artistic choice for her to put herself there and remotely control the camera so that she was just sort of walking in, possibly even it's a representation of her going towards the path. Who can say? So the next thing I want to talk about is retouching negatives. So she a widely sold 1890 photography guide from London it was widely distributed. You can see this is from the library of the University of California, and I've seen ads for it. Uh, it's likely that it's plausible that Annie Powell would have seen this when she was uh, before she left England. In fact, I've read this, and many of the phrases that you see in this book, which is about naturalistic photography, are repeated in some of her ads, talking about natural expression. These are phrases that come here again and again. But what I want to call your attention to is the uh, there's a whole chapter called Retouching Negatives. And Mr. Emerson, Peter Emerson, comes down really strongly. In no uncertain terms, you do not do that. It says the result is this retouching and painting over a photograph by incapable hands, by whom is always done as much to be deprecated. He talks about exaggeration of shadows and retouching would add to the falsity in another way. Do not do that, he says. So if Annie followed a lot of his dictate, a lot of what he suggested, she certainly did not follow that at all. And I could also say that, here we go. So in a summary about retouching negatives, so it was discouraged, it was difficult and time consuming. It wasn't cost effective. We know that she was making about 20 cents per photo, which is about $5 in today's dollars. And just to give that perspective, rent for a month would have been $25 to $60 a month. So it took a lot of work to pay rent. And it was counter to, it was unique among, so she was unique among Lowell photographers. I've examined a lot of other photographers, and nobody else did this negative retouching, especially with shadows. And it also helps explain her using glass plate negatives 40 years after they were obsoleted by Eastman Kodak's film. This particular one, which is at the Center for Lowell History, is stored as a film negative copy, and that's how they list it in their catalog as a film negative. In fact, it is a film negative copy. The original is lost, and I have some evidence, I have a lot of evidence to show how that happened and when that happened. The next photo I want to talk about is this one. So this one was taken around 1919 at Edson Cemetery in Lowell. And this person is Phyllis Devno, so Bob Bacon's grandmother. She would have been Bob Bacon's grandmother. He would have known her. He did know her, as did others in his family. This is her mother, Annie Wood Devno, who had that house with her husband where Annie Powell died. And this is her mother, Clara Wood. So Clara Wood in 1919, I believe this is 3 years. If Phyllis is 2.5 years, so this would be the anniversary of Clara. This would be, that's what makes this 1919. And Clara Wood would be observing the anniversary of her young child's death a few years before that of diphtheria. The child would have been buried here. In this photo session, 3 people, 1, 2, and Annie Powell, the photographer, would eventually be buried here. And speaking of burial plots, if you walk just a few steps away over here, years later, you would find Jack Kerouac's plot, his grave. This one remains unmarked. Jack's is the most visited graveyard at Edson Cemetery. Couple of other things about this photo I want to talk about, which have patterns of style. So this, I actually wanted to make the point that uniquely, this one is identified. Others I really had to identify. So I flip this as a negative and we get to see some interesting stuff. First of all, you see, it's a little hard to see, but you can see the manual intervention here that these shadows are not real. They're actually not, they don't reproduce the ground that we see in other places. And we also have a little bit of, you can see there's some intervention on some retouching on the side here. But we also have a couple of very almost bizarre things, I would say. Uh, we have sort of this seems to be, I can't really identify what it is. It's some kind of symbol of some kind, but that seems to be drawn in. We have a skeleton hand, which may actually be part of the glove drawn in that way. It's hard to tell, even on blowing up, whether that's drawn in or not. And finally, we have this part, which looks to be, no, it's actually two more things. There's a tattoo, which Clara did not have. We have many photos of her, no tattoo. This seems to be a cross, which I visited that area, sort of reproduces maybe some of the crosses that you see around there. But finally, this very strange thing, which appears to be some kind of collar around here, but it's not. It's drawn in. And my interpretation is that this would be sort of angel's wings. So this kind of religious symbolism, we know that Annie had uh, participated in a very devout Calvinist group called the Primitive Methodist Church. And we see that in a lot of her photos. Let's take a look at something else. I'm going to give you a moment to assimilate this very fantastical scene. Merrimack Mills, 1904. Here we have another mourner or someone posing as a mourner with a veil, very stark. We have someone over here, we don't know what they're doing. It's snow. And we have other things, but you won't see that unless I blow it up for you, which I'm going to do right now. We actually have another person back here almost guarding a gate, which may have a religious significance. We have a man's shoe. It's not likely someone walking along the snow would just discard a shoe. This was intentional. My colleague Brad McGowan has pointed out, and I think it's kind of true, not everybody sees it. This may be seen, it's not a coffin, but it may be seen as a coffin. And finally, one of the things we find a lot in Annie's religious allegories is some mode of transportation, almost as if swing low, sweet chariot coming for to carry you home, that kind of thing. We see horse carriages, we see cars, and this is not the first time we've seen in these kinds of allegories a train. And a train is very common, especially in old songs, which he would have been familiar with, taking you to the next land. So there's more. So I was curious, is it possible that this person could be any of Annie's relatives as models? So I went through all of them. I cleaned this up a little bit. You can see her face a little better. And in fact, Mary Alice Whiteley Townend, who we saw in that wedding photo, has a high probability, which I think is even higher than suggested because my experience with the facial recognition is that hats tend to lower the results, the positivity. And in fact, that bag that she carried is also seen in another photo in the city engineers, actually the earlier one where you saw her crossing the street. So the final photo I want to talk about is a comparison to the negative of the mill photo that started this whole talk and my whole search. So I've flipped that photo, this photo of this would be her niece, Phyllis Devno, at her confirmation in 1930, and this is about 1910. And one thing that's striking, there's a couple things striking to me. We have both the same kind of stuff. So we know she took this, and we suspect she took this. So we're comparing the two. So we have the same kind of thing there, same kind of thing there. We have shaft of light of actually turns out to be the opposite, dark here, more freehand than here, but same kind of thing here. And we also have a playfulness about these photos. So let's take a look at what this is going to look like. So, so those are the finished products. So another thing I can say about this is that I believe that I don't have my notes on this. So I believe that these photos were both taken by a diffusion lens that contributes to the softness. Very expensive lens. We know in the public record that the Powell studio owned a Bausch& Lomb diffusion lens. I think it was called a Unilens, which they paid $250 for in the early 1910s. So, and that would correspond, of course, with this. So, and that's many thousands of dollars today. Not too many photographers would have had that option. I believe, can't say for sure that these are both taken by a diffusion lens. So we're back to where we started, and I'm talking about a new history of the Camera collection, which I'll go through. So in my view, of the 133 glass plate negatives, 100 are likely Powell's. She took them in at least 4 occasions, about 1910 to 1923 at Appleton Mills and the back central neighborhood. That's the Portuguese neighborhood. And the rest are from at least 3 amateurs, including someone we know by name, Alberto Carrera. That was taken in 1919 in New Bedford. How did they all get together? Well, Powell would have been likely the processor for the amateurs because it was difficult to process. It took a lot of skill to process glass plate negatives. Not everybody would be able to do it. And she might have been someone who was known. There was a lot of back and forth, for instance, between New Bedford and Lowell. And one of the subjects in Powell's final effects is also in the camera collection with her family. That family is also in 6 other camera photos, which tells us that there was probably a personal and certainly a professional association between Annie Powell and those in the camera collection. So finally, the glass plate negatives were at Harris Avenue in the early 80s. That's what Bob told me on that first phone call. But they were sold to an antiques dealer. And my guess is, if we follow this provenance, is that the unknown buyer stored in the camera attic where they were rescued in 1989. That makes a lot of sense because there were not many glass plate negatives in the 80s, and certainly not in Lowell. So we have other associations that Powell had with the Appleton Mills, where these mill photos were taken at the Camera collection. So photographers were unwelcome in the mills about 1910. Think Bread and Roses strike 1912. Very difficult relationships with the mill workers and the mill owners. They didn't want people in taking pictures. And Powell enjoyed a 10-year professional and likely social relationship with the Appleton treasurer, Alexander Cumnock. They were both from the British Isles. Outside the Camera photos, we have photos of Appleton Mills inside staff on 3 other occasions with her handwriting. So these are conclusions that I've come to. I made them after talking to making a lot of friends, colleagues in the professional fields all over the world. And I've done a lot of research, and these are the conclusions that I've come to, namely that about 3,000 photos of her are found in these institutions and places. And I want to thank various people. One thing to note is that Bob Bacon is now our treasurer 4 years, 3.5 years later. And that, and we got Rebecca. She's on our board of directors. We have people from UMass Lowell. We have three people, two other people um, besides Bob, who are descendants of Annie Powell. And that's what I got. So any questions?
Yes. I
Yeah,
want to know, how did she get photos of herself in all of
that's a
those
yeah, that's
pictures?
a great question. Yeah. So you'd be surprised. There were even in the early 1900s, there were three ways. And we actually have photos of her taking it of herself, and her husband taking of a group. So the first way was they used a pneumatic tube with a bulb on the end. So they would squeeze the pneumatic tube
Mm.
to the shutter. But there was also timed exposures. And the third way is she probably got an assistant from the highway department, from the city engineers to actually, she set it up and they actually clicked the photo. Catherine, what do you think? What do you think is going on?
What do I think? Well, I'm wondering, did you find any property records or any income tax records for her too? I'm just wondering if that might also shed some light
Yeah.
on her activity and her. So,
Yeah, so that's a frustrating question because there are thousands of records in the Lowell City Hall attic that have been identified,
uh-huh.
and they are there is nobody to rescue those, and they're
Oh
probably
no.
rot. Yeah,
Oh dear.
I've been allowed to go up there, and I've actually found some Annie Powell photos, about three or four that are in very bad repair, but forensically interesting and whatever. But it's those are frustrating questions.
Right, because if she's paid 20 cents a photo, that's, and you said the rent was between 25 and $60 a month. And then also she'd have to have food and whatnot too.
Yeah, so
I'm,
she had roommates. She
oh,
when
okay.
she was yeah when she was living alone, she had roommates. She
Oh,
lived with her two sisters at
oh,
various times.
all right.
But the way I came up with the 20 cents is I actually did find records for the city paying her contractor, which was about 50 cents a photo. So that's what I came up with 20 cents because I didn't think I think they would exploit her. I don't think they're going to split it with her.
All right. Okay. No, that's interesting.
Yeah. Gary, what do you think?
I'm very impressed with all the work that you've
Yeah.
done, and also the creativity that you bring to looking at photographs. It's very impressive, what you've been able to do. Uh, I have a comment about the retouching and Peter Henry Emerson. Emerson's book was really for art photographers. Professional photographers routinely retouched their negatives beginning around 1870 when the portrait photographers started making larger format cabinet cards instead of carte de visites. And because of the larger size, retouching became very popular, and it was routinely done by professionals. When Emerson came along, he was an art photographer. And so he wasn't a commercial photographer at all. He was independently wealthy, and he wanted to make landscape photographs in the most natural style possible. So I wouldn't think that a professional like Annie would have, really paid any attention to what Emerson had to say as far as retouching goes. Retouching was routinely done by professionals to enhance their products.
So I think that's a good point, and it's making me think this slightly differently. So I've identified about 10 to 12 photos that she almost certainly took about the time that his book came out, which is, so he had many photos that were published widely about, it was in East Anglia of farmers farming and people on boats hauling. And he was sort of like part of um, the movement to let's go out in the field and see what real people are doing kind of thing. So she has a number of, like the haymakers, the French impressionists. So he has, and tell me if I'm speaking wrong, because this is not really my field. I know just a little bit. So she goes out there and she takes some, I think, remarkable photos of people working in the fields, including possibly, this is speculative, her father, who was an agricultural worker. It would have been about the same age. And in those photos, which I believe, so I'm making a lot of assumptions here, inspired by Emerson's book, she has the sham shadows, what I call the sham shadows. Uh, so, and it's also possible she did see herself as a photographer, as an art photographer. And after all, she was getting paid very little to take the photo that's behind me, but she spent hours, and she did 15 that day. She spent a lot of time trying to make it look beautiful in some way. So she must have had that personal aspiration. It's very complex. And I think you're pointing out the complexity of trying to figure out what someone's mindset would have been back then.
Fair enough.
Yeah. But
Uh,
it's a good point. I won't, maybe in the future I may not make that point so stridently that he was the only one out there, that there were others that were doing something different. I would also say, I'm sorry to talk too long on this, but also say it's still true that nobody else in Lowell was doing this. So that does make it a signature of hers.
Well, Henry Peach Robinson, wrote Pictorial Effect in Photography several decades earlier, and his book was, the standard book for photographers for many years. And he and Emerson, didn't see eye to eye at all. So
Okay.
Emerson was the new guy on the block at that point, 1890. And there were the photographers in England.
Yeah.
Were very much split between those who wanted to follow what Emerson was doing and the ones who more favored what Robinson's approach. So, and then the professionals were a totally different kettle of fish altogether, because they were doing what they thought their customers would want. So
Yeah.
it's a different story altogether. But retouching was very routinely done.
Okay. So I'm glad to be corrected on that, or course corrected on that. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions?
I just want to say again, Bernie, that I think you've done an enormous amount of research on this. I'm very impressed by the amount of, all the local archives you've been through, and you really are to be congratulated on all of this very intense research, because I certainly know what it's like.
You do. You've done,
You have to be
I've
persistent. You have to be
yeah.
persistent.
I've read your papers, and they're very well researched. Um, the truth, just a confession, part of it's out of fear. I mean, it's such a bizarre notion that this unknown person should be so well known and so obvious that I just keep thinking, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should find something else. So I act partly out of fear. But
Can you tell us more about your poster project here? I'm very impressed with all these posters that you're distributing around Lowell.
sure, what would you like to know about it?
Well, I find it very interesting that you've really got a lot of the public or a lot of the community buying into the project, and that's fantastic.
Yeah, well, a starting point is that it's free.
Aha, okay.
They're expensive to produce. They're just to print them are it's $150. So
Oh, my goodness.
yeah, we decided early on that we're going to go bust before we go low quality.
Right.
And we may still go bust, but you really can't do something like this with low quality. It's just not going to work. And the design has been great. Eileen Powers has been our curator. She's also a
Mhm.
designer. She's just done a great job. She has the William Morris wallpaper background, which just works so well, different colors. And yeah, so we have the QR codes. Sometimes people look at it, but so we have 14 out there now
Uh-huh.
out of 100. And we have a couple more that are have to be put up. And I don't really know. Uh, it's not like everyone's coming to my door saying, "I'm so glad you're doing that. We feel so much better about our city. We had no
Mhm.
idea." I think that's actually probably not the case. I think
Oh,
it becomes background, so I don't want to overstate it, but I think it's the right thing to do. And
mhm.
eventually, if you build it, they will come.
Absolutely. That's the approach.
Yeah. So, and it was a great idea. As soon as I mentioned it to the curator, I said, "Yeah, let's do that." Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming, and it's a delight to share this with you. It's been a lot of fun for me, and keep discovering more things really every day.
That's great.
I have a curious question. That where I showed that woman in the corner, get different questions on that, different interpretations. Is it really a woman? Could it be Annie Powell at 72? I mean, my imagination is I have a bias because I want to see that. Is it actually true? I don't know. And did anybody have an impression of that?
You're talking about the woman entering the church of
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Saint Jean
yeah,
Baptiste or something like that.
yeah.
It looked like a woman with the sturdy walking shoes, as you said. I don't know if I wouldn't be convinced that it's a self-portrait, but
Yeah. Well, we don't know that. Yeah.
we
But
don't
it's
know.
not like, yeah, but she looks like she could be 72. She doesn't look like she's a kid.
Right.
Um,
And it
yeah.
looks like a long figure, like you were saying, the other one, her walking the street,
Yeah.
it could be sort of a long torso.
Yeah, it's a long torso. Yeah.
It's a long
And
torso,
so,
yeah.
yeah. And all the ones that I've had, and by the way, we have many that are reflections of her in the window, and some are very
Oh,
striking. So that's one of the things that I've spent a lot of time on. So we do have a lot that are women with always a floppy hat in a window, and in one or two cases, she's with a camera. So
wow. Oh, that's
yes.
fantastic. That's really a find. I found in my own work, it's very hard to find the woman with the camera. So that's amazing.
Well, yeah. So it occurred to me, wait a minute, she's taking all these windows. It's for a city engineer. Some of them got to be at the right angle. So I found a number.
That's
In my
great.
file, I think I've listed. I probably have about 50. Not all of them are really convincing, and so there are various grades of convincing.
Mhm.
Maybe at some point there'll be some artificial intelligence that'll be able to put it together and really assemble it into what it really is, who it really is.